Now, this conference is all about choice, and specifically, it's about the choice of residential care provision for all people with a learning disability and/or autism. And we've heard this morning about the way the CQC implements the guidelines on the choice of residential care provision, detailed in registering the right support and right support, right care, right culture. And we know from those guidelines that best practice is that care homes should have no more than 6 people, and that congregate settings are not best practice. So congregate settings, village communities are not best practice, and no new provision of these settings will be considered. This afternoon, we've heard some moving testimonies from families whose relatives live in larger congregate settings, such as intentional and village communities. And I wouldn't be here speaking to you today if it wasn't for the fact that my sister, who lived in a village community, was threatened with eviction from the home that she lived in for 40 years. So, at Our Life, Our Choice, it came into being to challenge the CQC about their restrictive guidelines and to convince them to change their policies so as to enable people to have a choice to live in larger congregate settings such as village communities. Now, over a 2-year period, Our Life, Our Choice has had 4 online video meetings with senior representatives at the CQC, and on each occasion we asked them to provide the evidence that they have used to state that village communities and congregate settings are not best practice. And on every single occasion, they simply pointed us to the references that are cited in registering the right support, right care, right culture. So what I'm going to do is summarise the evidence that is contained in these references and try and demonstrate why it does not support the CQC guidelines should apply to the majority of people who have a learning disability. Now, in each of the slides, there will be an asterisk beside the publication. If it's there, it means that it's directly referenced in either of the CQC guidelines. So we've already heard about valuing people in 2001, and this at the time was considered quite a positive publication and probably, in retrospect, an overly optimistic vision. It had at its centre 4 main principles, those of rights, independence, choice and inclusion. And one of its 11 main objectives was to enable people with learning disabilities and their families to have a greater choice and control over where and how they live. And this went from the very small supported living, single-person accommodation, through small-scale ordinary housing, small care homes, larger care homes, and all the way up to village and intentional communities. And at the time, they identified 3,000 people living in around 73 communities. And for those people, it was associated with better activity planning, more routine day activities, and better access to health needs. They also identified that some local authorities were becoming reluctant to place people in these settings, and so the government said that they would issue statutory guidance to local councils to ensure they do not rule out any of these options. But of course, I don't think that ever came into being. Moving on from Valuing People 2001, we had an update, Valuing People Now, in 2009. Again, looking at residential care provision, it stated that all people with learning disabilities and their families have the opportunity to make an informed choice about where and with whom they live, although village communities in this document wasn't mentioned. But what they did mention was that they had identified a specific group of people who have a learning disability and challenging behaviour. And this represented between 19 to 32,000 of the 190,000 adults with a learning disability that were accessing disability services. And they determined that this particular group would require special consideration in the choice of residential care provision. And they referenced some research studies that were authored by Professor Mansell in 2007, and I'll come on to those on the next slide. Okay, so in 2007, Professor Mansell issued 2 reports. The first one, Services for People with Learning Disability and Challenging Behavioural or Mental Health Need, was a revision of an original report by him in 1993. And that provided recommendations to facilitate the continued closure of NHS campus-style inpatient hospital settings. But it focused on the lack of appropriate residential care provision just for this specific group of people and not for all people with learning disabilities. His second paper focused on people with a learning disability. It was a study that pulled together lots of different studies from 28 European countries. And in these studies, most of the people had challenging behaviour. And they concluded that smaller community-based settings were best for people with a learning disability who had challenging behaviour. But the studies specifically excluded intentional and village communities from its recommendations. So neither of these 2 studies really can be relied upon by the CQC as evidence to support their stance on the size of residential care provision for the majority of people who have a learning disability, because they weren't included in these studies. Now, between Valuing People 2001 and Valuing People Now in 2009, we had the establishment of the CQC, and we've already heard about what the aims of the CQC were. Their first big challenge came in 2011 with the Winterbourne View scandal, which was an expose by the BBC Panorama programme of systemic abuse of people who were in a private inpatient hospital assessment and treatment centre for people with a learning disability and who also had challenging behaviour. Now, the government's response to this, the Department of Health, set out its response in Transforming Care. It was a programme of action to transform services for people with learning disabilities or autism and mental health conditions or behaviours described as challenging. And it focused entirely on the group of people in NHS-funded and private inpatient hospitals, which at the time was about 3,500 people. And this group invariably had these behaviours that were considered very challenging. Now, this programme cites the Mansell reports 5 times, but there is no mention of valuing people now, or any mention of village communities. And it's in Transforming Care that we get the introduction of the concept that people with challenging behaviour should live in accommodation of 6 people or less. And indeed, they referred to the NICE guidelines to get to this figure. But again, in Transforming Care, there was no evidence or recommendation pertaining to the majority of people with learning disability. It focused entirely on people with challenging behaviour. Now, 4 publications quickly followed this. We had Building the Right Home, Building the Right Support, which became the National Plan, and the Service Model and its supplementary information. These 4 documents together form the National Plan and Service Model to inform all health and social care commissioners with respect to the provision of social care services, specifically for people with a learning disability and challenging behaviour. But they came together to form the core of best practice guidance. Now, one thing I noticed about all of these documents is that they state in a footnote at the beginning that people with learning disability and or autism and behaviour that challenge will hereafter be people with a learning disability and or autism. So presumably they did this to try and abbreviate what was a very long definition. But of course, what it did was introduce confusion, because if you dip into any one of these documents and go straight to the section that deals with residential care provision, you'll see learning disability and autism. So you'll assume that these recommendations and guidelines should apply to everyone, but actually they were focused specifically on people with challenging behaviour. So there's really no evidence in these that can be relied on by the CQC to justify their stance. Now, the guidelines that we saw in Valuing People and Valuing People Now, and all of the guidelines and recommendations that came out of publications looking at people with challenging behaviour, came together in Registering the Right Support, which was published in 2017. Now, these were guidelines and regulations that service providers must follow in order to register new residential care provision for all people with a learning disability and autism. The principles of Valuing People and Valuing People Now were supplanted by those in the National Plan and its associated guidance. And I'll go through this in a bit of detail because it's quite important. So the introduction started with Winterbourne View, immediately cited Valuing People in the Mansell reports. It then goes on to cite Building the Right Support and Building the Right Home with its accompanying service model, which became a best practice model. And then over 3 pages, this background summarised the guidance from these documents, mixing terminology between people with a learning disability and people with a learning disability who display behaviour that challenges. And then it all comes together in a single paragraph on page 6, which cements the conflation of this guidance between these different groups of people. It says, the service model within Building the Right Support refers specifically to people with a learning disability who display behaviour that challenges. We do, however, believe that the underpinning principles of choice, promotion of independence and inclusion for individuals are fundamental to what a good service looks like for every person with a learning disability. So suddenly, they've decided, it's a belief, that all people with a learning disability should follow the recommendations that have been based on research into a very specific group of people who have behaviour that challenges. So without reference to any qualitative research, the CQC guidance has determined that all people should be treated as also having behaviour that challenges. And providers of registered care for any person with a learning disability must now adhere to the Service Model, National Plan and other guidance which was developed specifically for people who also displayed challenging behaviour. So we heard how Registering the Right Support is actually a document that pertains to the registration of new services. And I think the CQC realised this, and then in 2020 they published Right Support, Right Care, Right Culture, which updated and clarified their position with respect to all types of social care for people with learning disability, including the size of residential accommodation. So we're now at the point where the CQC defines what is good practice in terms of the size of residential provision. And it makes itself very clear. Residential care should usually be provided in small, community-based units of no more than 6 people, and that they would only register and favourably rate services that allow people's dignity and privacy to be maintained and that facilitate person-centred care. This must be in line with current best practice guidance and not be developed as new campus or congregate settings. And then they came up with definitions for campus and congregate. So now campuses are group homes clustered together on the same site and usually sharing 24-hour staff and some facilities. And congregate settings are separate from communities and without access to the options, choices, dignity and independence that most people take for granted in their lives. And I'm going to come on to talk about those definitions in a couple of slides' time. But just to summarise where we're at now, we had valuing people now, which created a wide range of choice of residential accommodation, from individual housing up to and including village and intentional congregate communities. Separate to this, for the small group of people with a learning disability who displayed significant challenging behaviour, a national plan and service model was developed. Few choices of residential accommodation for this group were deemed appropriate, and ideally it would be individual accommodation up to shared housing comprising no more than 6 people. The CQC then developed regulations for registration for providers of new residential accommodation, registering the right support, right care, right culture, which was based on best practice. And as I've shown, this best practice actually applied the restricted choices for people with challenging behaviour to all people with a learning disability. And yet they provided no evidence to support this ideology. Okay, so let's have a look at what CQC defined congregate settings as. So congregate settings are separate from communities and without access to the options, choices, dignity and independence that most people take for granted in their lives. Now, that's not really a definition. It's really a description of a badly run service. And it could apply as much to a supported living environment as a village community. Now, this description was taken from the chairman's forward of a working group report that focused on moving people from congregated settings into the community in Ireland. But actually, if you actually look in the body of that document, it actually states that a congregate setting is defined as settings where 10 or more people with disabilities live. So in registering the right sport, it doesn't actually tell you what a congregate setting is, it just says it's bad for you. At least in this paper, they actually put a definition on a congregate setting. The study also specifically stated that residential services for people with autism were not included in the study, and nor were intentional communities. And so again, you can't really use this as evidence for the vast majority of people with a learning disability. Okay, now looking at campus settings. So we had a definition in Right Support, Right Care, Right Culture that campuses are group homes clustered together on the same site and usually sharing staff and some facilities. Now, this description of a campus was taken from one of the Mantle papers in 2007. And in this paper, there's a clear distinction between campus settings and village communities, where a campus refers to clusters of care homes in the grounds of inpatient mental hospitals and assessment centres. And Mansell acknowledged that the study supported the development of a range of models, as acknowledged in the government's white paper in 2001, provided that residents were given genuine and informed choices about their accommodation. Okay, so we saw this morning Dr. Joyce talked about research papers and evidence that CQC had relied upon to develop their guidelines. But inevitably, these kinds of research papers can only draw on a very small cohort of people in order to gather their evidence. And at Our Life, Our Choice, we were interested in trying to find a bigger data set in order to get a better and clearer idea of what was going on. Why does it matter how the CQC guidelines have been developed? Well, over the last 20 years, approximately 40 intentional congregate and village communities have closed. As we've already heard, Freedom of Information has revealed that local authority commissioners cite wording in registering the right support, right care, right culture as the reason they will not use such provision, even if they think these settings would be appropriate. The CQC are now starting to inspect and rate local authorities themselves, and this will inevitably influence the decisions on residential placements because they won't want to get a poor rating from the CQC. On the other side, providers state that CQC policy on size and location forces them to reconsider their provision. And finally, the CQC will not consider registration of new congregate or village communities, and so no such communities will evolve. All of this results in people who choose to live in these larger settings being forced to relocate away from their social group and preferred environment, and other people are going to be deprived of the choice to live in these communities. This one here. Okay, so going back to data sets. So looking for a bigger data set, we realise that there's a wealth of information available on the CQC website. Now, the CQC inspects over 166,000 social care regulated services, and all of these are available to view on the CQC website. Now, having been trained as a research scientist, I love big data sets, but even I can't cope with 166,000 of them. So thankfully, the CQC offer a filter service on their website, and so we filtered down the reports for care homes that are active, that are residential homes, and that are for learning disability. And this produced around 5,000 services. Now, that's still too many for me. So thankfully, the CQC rates the service provision as either outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. And so by further filtering, I was able to pull out all of the outstanding care homes. And this gave us a list of 187 regulated residential care homes for people with a learning disability. Now, you would imagine that for a service to attain an outstanding rating from the CQC, it would need to fully comply with national best practice and fundamental guidance and principles in its guidelines. But what do we find? Well, looking specifically at the size of the residential service, where it states residential care should usually be provided in small, local community-based units of no more than 6 people, what do we find? So we see there's 187 regulated services, and actually 95 of them, or 51%, actually have more than 6 residents in them. Okay, so already we can see that it's the norm for care homes to have more than 6 people, and yet they still get an outstanding rating. So what can be wrong with them? So if we then further look at the data and take those 95 care homes that have more than 6 people, how many of those would actually be defined as congregate settings or campus settings, using congregate settings as being 10 or more residents and campus settings as being clusters of 3 or more units on the same site? And we find that of those 95 care homes with more than 6 people, actually 57% of those, over half of them, are congregate or campus settings, yet again, they are given an outstanding rating. How is that possible? Because, they don't follow best practice. And even the inspectors don't know how to deal with this, because the inspectors measure the care homes on right support, right care, right culture principles of a model of care and setting that maximises people's choice. The care has to be person-centred, and the ethos, values and attitudes ensure people use services that lead confident, inclusive and empowered lives. Now, in these reports, the inspectors often will state at the beginning whether they believe that the service meets the principles of registering the right support, right care, right culture. And so if we look at those care homes that would be considered congregate or campus, 70% of the inspectors considered that they were indeed in line with the principles of the CQC's guidance. And only 22% thought that they didn't. So to summarise that, over 50% of outstanding regulated care homes accommodate more than 6 people. Of these, more than 50% are congregate or campus settings. And of these congregate and campus settings, over 70% apparently meet the principles in registering the right support, right care, right culture. So this is a clear, real-world demonstration that the size and location of residential care provision in a well-managed and regulated service has no negative impact on the quality of life of the residents. Now, there is no good evidence in either of those 2 guidelines to support the CQC stance that congregate and campus settings cannot provide access to the options, choices, dignity and independence that most people take for granted in their lives. CQC inspectors have determined that in many cases, these settings offer an outstanding provision. Therefore, Our Life, Our Choice is campaigning for a full range of choice of residential care provision for all people with a learning disability. The CQC's role should be to enable better care, not restrict it. and so must ensure that choice includes village and intentional congregate communities. And I think, I'm just in time. Thank you.